Hi, welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Shannon Eliot. Today we'll be discussing an issue that many of us have experienced at one time or another, emotional eating. Lisa Bograd has been a therapist for 12 years. She specializes in treating trauma, eating disorders, and addiction. Lisa is deeply committed to helping people liberate themselves from the shackles of food and weight obsession so that they can have better lives and relationships. Lesley Wirth is a life coach, facilitator, and counselor. She has also struggled with emotional eating. Lesley uses her personal experiences to help others in attaining a healthy mind, body, and spirit. She is passionate about helping her clients learn self-love and how to create the lives they want. Welcome, Lisa, and welcome, Lesley. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Lisa, how would you define emotional eating?
So loosely speaking, I would say that emotional eating is eating in response to a range of negative emotions such as anger, sadness, fear, boredom, or eating to satisfy emotional needs rather than to satisfy physical hunger. But I also see emotional eating on a continuum because I feel like to some degree in our culture we all indulge in emotional eating from time to time, and I think it's somewhat normative. You know, we go to a party and we're not necessarily hungry, but they're having some cake, or we're at an office event and they're throwing a party for a coworker and we might have something there, or to celebrate, or just, Thanksgiving. I think people aren't necessarily, always hungry, but it's part of a ritual that we partake in together. So, I think that's kind of on one kind of end of the spectrum, and then there's kind of a medium range where emotional eating becomes a little bit more habitual, where it's not just those occasional times, but it becomes more frequent and a little bit more problematic for a person, where it's something that they feel like they need to do with more frequency. And then at the end of the extreme, I would say emotional eating becomes more of an addiction. And in that category, I would put binge eating disorder, which is actually a newly recognized diagnosis in the new diagnostic manual. And that's really when it becomes a problem, where it's very addictive and compulsive and repetitive, and people really feel like they have to do it pretty much on a daily basis, and it becomes just a part of a coping mechanism, and it really can debilitate a person. So that's kind of how I see it in a broad range.
Lesley, what is your experience with emotional eating?
My experience is on the far end of the spectrum with what Lisa was talking about in terms of addiction. I have used food to check out, and so for me, emotional eating is usually I'm disconnecting from something. In the past, it would be not eating to eating out of compulsivity, and just as a way to not be fully in my body.
To escape.
To escape, yeah.
Lisa, why do we tend to reach for less than healthy things when we're stressed out? Generally, when we're sad or emotional, we don't really reach for green beans, and more maybe the Ben and Jerry's side of things. So why is that?
Yeah, great question. So, I think that stress results from an imbalance between the environmental load and the individual's perceived ability to cope with that load. And when people are under stress, it leads to heightened levels of physiological arousal, which stimulates stress hormones. Cortisol and adrenaline are among the stress hormones that are released. And typically, when that happens, people will search out a source of comfort to deal with the stress that they're feeling and the stress that's in their body. And food is actually a very kind of immediate and gratifying source of comfort, and it tends to assuage the stress hormones by releasing dopamine, which is a really kind of a positive mood experience. And so I think that there's a definite correlation between that, and we've seen that prolonged stress is often associated with an increase in energy consumption. So we're at work, we're like feeling really, really stressed, and we kind of feel like we need to kind of recharge our batteries, and food is there. It's a quick way to recharge the batteries. It really works. It gratifies us in the moment. gives us something that we're, kind of an energy boost that we're craving. And we tend to crave in those moments not the vegetables, right? We crave the foods that are high in fat, sugar, salt. It's just kind of how the body works, and those are the foods that we tend to reach for. And studies have shown that perceived high levels of stress predicts a 3 times higher frequency of binge eating than perceived lower levels of stress. So there's definitely a correlation between increased stress and increased binging. And again, the particular foods that we look for when we're under the stress are those foods that are going to release more of the dopamine into our body, and it really does work in the short term.
So you both work with clients. You hope to help them overcome unhealthy relationships with food and help them overcome any personal internal struggles they may have. How common would you say emotional eating is?
From my experience, it's really common. And what I've found in working with people is usually the reason they call me or contact me is related to them wanting to change their relationship with food. But after an in-depth hour conversation or so, there's something much deeper going on that they really want to address. And they're playing it out with food because they don't know how else to deal with it. And it definitely has to do with what Lisa was just saying, feeling like the environment is too stressful for the person and that they can't handle it. And so there's this thought of, I don't know what else to do. And so that becomes the go-to when they don't know what else to do. And so really getting into why is it that they feel there's nothing that they can do about it and how to create that opportunity.
So yeah, I would say that emotional eating is, just like Leslie said, I think it is a pretty common phenomenon for people, again, kind of on the continuum. But even with binge eating disorder, it is a pretty common form of eating, unfortunately, that people do in our culture. And we do live in a culture where there's so much more stress today than there's ever been before. Studies are showing that, since like 2008, since the kind of the recession, that people, their stress levels have increased by like 10% from what they were. And people are also, statistically speaking, one of the ways that they're using to kind of cope is not only alcohol, but is engaging in emotional eating or binge eating, which is why we have such a great problem with obesity in the country as well, although that certainly predated, the recession. But I think the statistics are anywhere between like 48 to 50% of people will kind of engage in some form of emotional eating, and it really is, a serious problem. And it's, the troubling patterns are resulting in people, just again, on the continuum from really it being a serious health problem to it being just more of an impairing problem where they feel in a lot of distress, where they're having trouble just kind of functioning kind of normatively, and where they're really needing to find a quick source of comfort, and food really does provide that for them, and in the absence of being able to find other means to comfort themselves.
You both mentioned stress multiple times as a big indicator or cause of emotional eating. We get stressed at work a lot. Jobs are very often a huge source of stress, if not the most stressful things in our lives. What do you tell people whose main source of stress is their job and they're eating because of it? That's really tough because that's their livelihood. And that's not something you can necessarily cast aside and get rid of very easily. So what do you do when you run into folks like that or you have clients like that?
I mean, there's a number of things that I would say that, in terms of, first there's the actual stress level, right, that we talked about. If the load is more than they can handle, which I think, again, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who feel that their stress load is a bit more than they can handle, or maybe much more than they can handle. And so that's, first of all, something to really look at and to take seriously. And I know a lot of people feel like, well, they can't make any changes in that because they, financially are needing their jobs. And so I wouldn't necessarily take the drastic measure of quitting one's job, but I would say to really look at that and think about how, if anything, a person can make some small changes in that situation, such as, you know, can they maybe take a break during their work day and have some time that they just kind of set aside for, you know, having their lunch, you know, and in not having to eat really, really, really quickly and then go back to the work, but just like setting aside a half an hour.
Actual lunch break.
Exactly, and actually take a lunch break, you know, even if Joe Blow is not, you know, everybody else is around them is doing their own thing, that this is about you right now. And so to take that time for yourself, or to go outside, you know, and go for a walk. And then we would start to talk about, you know, how to begin to entertain the idea of kind of a more normative eating pattern, because I think people, you know, once they get really off base with the emotional eating, it really throws their whole eating patterns, you know, out of whack. And so looking at how to kind of begin to you know, cultivate an eating behavior where it's more regulated, so that they have a breakfast and then maybe they have a lunch or a snack in the afternoon or a dinner. And so it's not like, okay, you know, I don't eat any breakfast because I'm in a really big hurry and I got to get to the office, so I amp up with the coffee, and then I kind of, at 12 o'clock I'm starving, so I, you know, get the munchies, and I'm, you know, then I do some, you know, serious mindless eating, and then I'm kind of like in a coma for a little while, and then I kind of get some more coffee. And you know, so I really try to help them to get back into and really try to implement a pattern of eating that's more kind of regulated and conscious. Because a lot of, you know, I think Lesley talked about this, the mindlessness. A lot of the emotional eating really is mindless eating. And if you can really be conscious of when you're eating, that's why I say that lunch break, if you can really be conscious and pay attention to your eating, and you can register then the experience of satiation at that point, and that you don't necessarily then need to kind of keep impulsively, you know, getting more.
Lesley, how did you feel both in the moment when you're emotionally eating and then afterwards? Did you ever have a mood lift?
No. I never actually had a mood lift. I had a disconnect, like I told you. And so it was an opportunity, I think, when I was emotionally eating, to move from feeling powerless and overwhelmed to this is just not so intense. But I never actually felt good or better. There was never a positive. There was a
neutral.
This isn't so crazy for me right now. And it gave me this false sense of I can handle it, and I can handle being in my body, because I could if I wasn't fully in it. So it was kind of that, you know, it was like a trick I played on myself. And yeah, I think that would be the most accurate answer.
When did you make that connection that you were eating because of unresolved emotional issues?
When I was bulimic for 13 years. Before I moved into more of the emotional eating. And so as I made that change, I learned how my habits with food were directly related to my thought patterns and my inability to cope with really my own inner world, was in the way I related to my life around me. Because other people were in the same circumstances and not overeating. So it was my belief systems of, again, I bring up powerlessness. I really felt powerless in the world and within my own self.
And how did you eventually overcome the emotional eating battle?
Well, that's kind of a sticky question for me, because I'm so aware now, I'm hyper aware of my relationship to food, and so I still think that I do emotionally eat sometimes. What that could look like for me is drinking a Diet Coke. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'm doing something that I don't really want to be doing, because I know that Diet Coke's bad for me, you know, and it's not a good or a bad, but I'm just so aware of how each choice is, whether I'm fully present and consciously choosing it or not. And when I do get really stressed, food is the place that I want to go. And knowing that comes the opportunity for me to empower myself through making a choice of what kind of life do I want to create for myself? Do I want to create one where I'm continuing to live on the past, or creating in the now what I want the rest of my life to be like.
Lisa, how do you work with clients in helping them overcome emotional eating?
I really do think that one of the key pieces is helping them to get, Leslie's talking about being more in alignment with themselves, which I think is a wonderful kind of image and idea. And one of the ways I think people first and foremost are out of alignment when they come to see me is that their eating patterns are out of alignment, and eating is a pretty central kind of behavior and need. And so to start to begin to help people to get that back in alignment, and I think it gets out of alignment for a lot of different reasons. I think that the dieting mentality that so many of us engage in is one of the first ways we get out of alignment with food in particular. And it teaches us to not be tuning into our own bodies and our own experiences of hunger and satiety, but to be more concerned with how many calories is in something and how much weight I'm going to be losing if I don't eat that, or if I eat that sugar food, how that's going to be affecting me. So it's really something that feels like a really important thing for my clients to learn about, and some of them are open to that piece, to really wanting to kind of, we can either talk about it or I might refer them to a nutritionist who works with eating issues, not just from the diet mentality, because that's not the kind of nutritionist that I want them to be seeing, but more from somebody who's going to help them to kind of start to begin to think about legalizing, like this whole good food, bad food thing, I think is another way people get out of alignment with food. And not to say that there isn't some truth that there are some foods that, that have more sugar content and more fat content, and they're not the healthiest for you, but it's the way that we think about them that then, when we make them taboo, then that sets up this really difficult dynamic where they become more appealing because they're taboo. So really starting to work at that level too of noticing the good-bad dichotomy and seeing if they're willing to try to allow a little bit more inclusiveness of those foods and see what happens, and then we talk about that. And so trying to get them to be more regulating of their food and normalizing and including, certain foods in their diet. And so that's one piece of a very big kind of equation. That's one important piece. And then I think really trying to get at what's eating them, right? To use that metaphor, like what's really going on, to help them to begin to tune in. Like when you reach for that, or those M&Ms, what do you have any sense of what was going on? Like what was happening in your day? And sometimes it's such a kind of, I think Lesley again spoke about this, that there's such a disconnect from one's body, not only in terms of hunger and satiety, but in terms of emotion. So that they're not even aware that, oh, well, maybe their friend just made a critical comment to them, and then they just find themselves reaching for this bag of M&Ms, and they didn't even have any awareness. And so helping them to begin to make that connection and to be able to start to become more mindful, both in terms of, I know you might say that you want to eat that right now, but can you just check in with yourself, even if it's just for a few seconds before if you want to reach for that, fine, but see if you can start to cultivate listening to yourself and checking in with yourself. And so starting to break that mindless pattern. And that's definitely something that I really try to work with them. And then, the type of therapist I am, I'm more of a kind of depth psychotherapist, so I really do try to look at what are some of the deeper issues here. How were you related to in your life? Were there any traumas that went on? And so that's a deeper piece of the work that I really do because that can be a part of it for people, is that from young ages they started coping, using food as a coping mechanism because maybe there wasn't a parent available to soothe them and to comfort them, or maybe there was abuse and this was like the only way that they could comfort themselves. So starting to get at that deeper stuff is another thing that I really do try to do with them, and building a relationship with them where they begin to feel safe to connect with themselves. And because for people who've had trauma, people become unsafe and food becomes the safety for them. And so if they can begin to trust another human being and be able to let some of that stuff be known, and then they can start to begin to trust themselves and their own bodies, that can be a really profound work.
I think Lisa makes a really good point in that finding safety is so important. Sometimes it helps for people to just, it can feel so unsafe to go within oneself at that deep level and to start looking at that trauma and to be with those feelings that would come up, that people are afraid to go there. And so to have somebody that they can sit with, that they fully trust, who can help walk them through the process and be with them, I think is so vital. And to try to do it alone is really challenging. And I don't believe that we're made to live a life where we have to take ourselves through these things alone. It's the biggest step a person could take is actually just being honest and saying, I want to try, and trying to find somebody that they feel that they can try with.
And I imagine that takes some degree of time.
Definitely. That's right. I think that, a lot of the patients that I see, are very kind of reserved at first and distrustful, and they may have had, experiences with therapists where they, I think it takes, I think that it really does require a certain specialty in this to really understand, somebody who's got eating disordered issues. So, sometimes they've been through the gamut of therapists and they're like, yeah, you're not going to get it, or I'm, not going to be able to trust you. And it takes time for them to test and to get that I can get it, and that I can hold what's going on for them, or that I'm not going to be easily manipulated, and that I am going to be able to kind of really go to the hard places or ask the hard questions, and not even if they've had difficult experiences with other therapists. I mean, a lot of them have had difficult relational experiences in general, right? Where people have not been trustworthy, where they've been unsafe in different ways. Maybe somebody, again, is a parent who's an alcoholic and who's just unavailable, and that's more of the extreme. And there's a kind of a continuum, or it may just be a parent who just was well-meaning, but wasn't really able to hear them and listen to them, that they had their own anxieties that kind of got in the way, that intruded on them really being able to tune in to this person in a deeper way. So there's a lot of kind of testing to be able to see, well, is it possible to have a different experience with somebody else? And that really does take time for them to begin to trust that can happen, and for them to then have an experience of a different kind of relationship that then allows them to have the ability to parent themselves differently. Because I think a lot of the ways that people are using food, sometimes it's because there's either an emptiness there that they're trying to fill, or because they're treating themselves in a way that maybe they were treated in a harmful way and repeating that cycle. So to begin to have a relationship that can help them to relate differently to themselves really does take quite some work to get there.
Lesley, what are some effects emotional eating has had on your life, and what would you tell someone who might be watching right now who is struggling with the same issue?
Well, it's a lot of heaviness, a lot of shame, guilt, self-loathing. And I would say that the majority of the negative effects it's had on me personally has been the way I feel and view myself. And that it's emotional eating created this reality in which I was the perpetrator and the receiver of feeling negative. I was giving the negativity and feeling the negativity, and I just kept creating that cycle. And so what I would offer for somebody would be to start with really just getting honest with the reality of how they're showing up for themselves. And I think it was easy for me to say, well, I'm doing the best I can, and I was, but I needed to get further help, and I needed a community, and I needed to be okay with the fact that I needed help and that I needed something more in my life. And I had to start with just being really honest with my limitations at the time. And so I would invite people to really have a truthful inquiry with themselves, and then listen to their gut. They also have the wisdom, within them to find the right direction, and the right person and the right remedy for them. So it really becomes having the courage to follow through on the direction that comes from within. And I think that can be helped through conversation. They don't have to necessarily even believe when they reach out that it's going to work, but just start having the conversation and be brutally honest. That, in my opinion, is going to be more helpful than any protocol, any diet, anything, is to just really show up fully with themselves.
Well, thank you, Lesley, and thank you, Lisa, for joining me and sharing your wisdom and experiences today. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our pleasure, my pleasure.
Overeaters Anonymous offers a program of recovery from compulsive eating that addresses physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. To learn more, visit overeatersanonymous.org. Feeding the Hungry Heart, The Experience of Compulsive Eating and Breaking Free from Emotional Eating by Janine Roth are books designed to help those struggling with emotional eating. To find more information on compulsive eating and other eating disorders, check out the National Eating Disorders Association website at nationaleatingdisorders.org. To learn more about Lisa and her offices in Oakland and San Francisco, visit her website at therapyforchange.net. To learn more about Lesley, visit her website at livingyourtruth.com. To find more resources on emotional eating, be sure to visit the Peers website at peersnet.org. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.